So what is kind of your take on where labor is now? Are you optimistic for the future?
Well, I'm hopeful. And if you read Rebecca Solnit, there's a difference between being optimistic and hopeful. Optimistic is you assume things are just going to turn out fine, and you don't really invest much in it. You just kind of gleefully hope it's all going to be good, or assume it's going to be good. Hopeful is where you believe it could turn out well. And I think that we can honestly say at this point that it is possible to be hopeful about the future of labor in America, that we believe it can turn out well. That was not the case not that many years ago. We went through a period of radical deindustrialization, neoliberalism, a period where, frankly, our laws and our structures were structured against labor, against working people. And we saw the results of that. Towns hollowed out, people, left without jobs, but more deeply, kind of whole sectors of our economy disappearing. And I wrote a lot about that. I covered the fights over NAFTA and GATT and the 1999 protests against the WTO in Seattle, and everything that's come from that over the years. And all of the dire predictions of labor activists turned out to be true, right? It was tough. It was very tough. So unions shrank. They shrank not just in their power, but also, or in membership, but also in their ability to influence politics, right? They were sort of pushed to the sidelines politically. And you saw the Democratic Party, which had traditionally been very close to unions, abandon the trade union movement on a number of issues. What's happened in the last few years has been amazing. And I think you can trace it to both practical working class and working people issues. The fight for a $15 wage, which seemed audacious at the time and now seems just common sense. The fight for a lot of other, baseline initiatives to address income inequality and unfairness and injustice. The recognition that deindustrialization really has left, huge sectors of our economy, communities, people left behind. I think that's much more understood today. And so all of this was in play. You saw a great many, particularly after Seattle, but even more so after the 2011 protests in Wisconsin and Ohio and other places, a great many young people and with Occupy Wall Street who came into the labor movement and said, I want to be a part of this. I want to build something back. And so I think that's the root of it. Then you had Bernie Sanders run for president. And I think Bernie Sanders' militantly pro-labor stance kind of shook the Democratic Party, drew a lot more people into politics as pro-labor activists. And then each step along the way, new leadership in unions, more militant leadership, takeover of unions by younger, more activist people. We've ended up with a situation now where, we've just had a union summer, right? Where major unions went on strike or threatened to strike and had big victories, won huge contracts, and are preparing to go do a lot more. That's the UAW, that's the Teamsters, that's a lot of other unions. We're nowhere near where we ought to be. I report a lot around the world. I spend a lot of time in Scandinavia and in Iceland. In Iceland, everybody's unionized, right? If you go on a boat to look at the northern lights, the people on the boat are unionized, right? Everybody is. And it works as a society. We're kind of the opposite of that. We have only a small portion unionized, but I do think that
and we don't work as a society.
No, absolutely not. We have massive inequality. Well said. Well said. And so just the last thing I'll say about it is that I think that it is within reason that in the next 5 years, we could double union membership in the United States. Now, that requires labor law changes. That requires a lot of militancy. It requires, frankly, a lot of political barriers to be taken down. There's all sorts of challenges. But I actually think that's possible. And if I'm right, then, we are looking at something that may not be a full-on New Deal era, but we have an era which at least has that possibility.
Well, even to me, it's so interesting. And I'm sure, you could really speak to this in droves, but it's like we've had 60 years of anti-union propaganda fed down the American people's throats. And also just efforts to decimate the unions, have, like some unions don't have the best leadership, which then will sour people to the whole idea of it. And we have to basically fight back against all of that. And it gets, it's not easy to do. Yet, despite all that, you're seeing stuff that I never would have thought I'd see. I mean, even just like the effort at Starbucks comes to mind
Yeah.
first, where they were just union. I mean, at first it was like this one shop voted to unionize, and it was, oh man, wow, I can't believe this happened. Then it feels like in a matter of weeks, you couldn't keep track of all of them. It was almost every shop, and it was freaking awesome to see. So I mean, was that inspiring to you? Like were you expecting that?
Inspiring. No, I mean, it's kind of it's the reason I went into this game was to write about that, and and this is a terrible analogy, right? But the reason you go into political reporting, and I do a lot of political reporting, is to write about elections. You can lie and say, oh, well, I'm really interested in governing and stuff like that. But by and large, most people that go into political reporting want to write about elections. You want to go into war reporting, you probably intend to write about war, et cetera, et cetera. You want to go into business reporting, you want to write about businesses that are making a whole bunch of money. If you go into labor reporting, what you want to write about is labor on the march, right? You don't want to write about labor in decline, right? You don't want to say, oh, wow, I'm here to, preside over the end of the labor movement or to put the period on the sentence. No, you're interested in it as a dynamic force in our society. And so, is it inspiring to see what's going on? Absolutely, it is. But what I will tell you, Ron, and I think this is important, the inspiration has always been there, right? It's just been isolated and it hasn't been given the attention that it needs. I've written about labor, not always. Sometimes I've been much more on the political side, but I've been writing about labor for decades. And there's never been a year where there hasn't been a struggle someplace, where somebody isn't organizing courageously in the rural South and in right to work states in the West and in factory towns that have just been abandoned. There's always somebody out there doing it and heroes that you can write about. What's different now is two things. One, critical mass. There's a lot more of it going on. Frankly, being pro-union is cool. Being engaged in trade unionism is cool. Polling shows 2/3 of people are excited about it. And the dynamic folks in our society, young people, right? Not the only dynamic people. I don't want to be, ageist, but the folks who are, ready to go out and do something. Polling shows that something like almost 90% of young people have pro-union sentiment, right? It's just through the roof. And so that gets you to critical mass. And then the other part of it, which is, another part of my life, because I write a lot about media, the social media, with all of its flaws, has made it possible for that isolated person in Alabama who's organizing or in Wyoming who's organizing to spread the word, right? And so suddenly you've got allies and comrades and friends around the country, even around the world. And that's profound because one of the most difficult things for trade unionism has always been isolation, right? Trade unionism doesn't work on the individual level, right? Trade unionism works with groups of people coming together. And if it's a small group of people in an isolated spot, maybe a place that doesn't have a union tradition, that can be very alienating. It can be very difficult. So I do think that the modern era with social media, with a lot more communications, has made it possible for people to connect up, link up with one another, and build this movement out. And so that's why I think the combination is pretty good right now.
So let's go backwards a little bit. When I first heard about, like, when I first became aware of you, it was through some of your articles and then also your Dollarocracy book with Dr. Bob McChesney. I was very interested in the media reform movement. I think I've read pretty much all of his books of that era. And I remember there used to be the Media Reform Conference that Free Press sponsored, among others. I remember you were there. And that all kind of seemed to have fractured off from about like 2013 to present. And, I was just sort of an outsider looking in, going to stuff when I could. And I was like just out of college and about to go into graduate school. But what's like your perspective of all that? Like what's kind of your take on that timeline and what happened and what fractured and where things are at now?
Yeah, I don't know that it fractured. I'm not sure that's the right word.
Okay.
Although I would be very cautious about debating a comedian on choice of words. But
I'm not married to fractured. You can.
Yeah. I mean, but I think the movement's still relatively united. The
Mhm.
problem is that the industry has fractured,
Okay.
right? And so the targets have changed, and much of what we're dealing with is different than when we started. Bob McChesney and I started writing about media in the 1990s, late 1990s. At that point, media was in a period of radical change, which we didn't even fully understand. Not even Bob and I, even though we were some of the first people to write about digital media and things like that. And it was still a time when the dominant source of news gathering in most communities was a big newsroom at a big newspaper, right? And when that newspaper hit your doorstep on Sunday morning, it was so big and so heavy it could crack the cement, right? Those newspapers are gone in huge portions of the country. We also still had a reasonable amount of independent radio at that time. That's been, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was one of the things that really got Bob and I starting writing about some of these issues. That has decimated a lot of commercial radio. And then you've got, changes in television, it's systematizing of television. We knocked down barriers to cross ownership, and not all of cross ownership, but in some cases. And so we've ended up in a situation where a lot of what were traditionally independent stations are now kind of all interwoven with companies, interwoven with one another. I could go into it, but we don't have enough time. What I can tell you, frankly, is that the media system blew up, right? We had this digital moment, which allowed advertising to flee out of commercial media, right? And the source of resources, or the resources that sustain journalism, went elsewhere. And so this, Ron, because every time you look up, how to buy a new pair of shoes online, if you don't buy that pair of shoes, what do you see the next day? They're back trying to sell them to you,
Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah.
Newspaper
Or
can never do
similar
that.
shoes. Yeah.
Right. But the newspaper can never do that. There were even radio and television. I mean, you love it or hate it, what digital does, what an online communications does, is allow for commercial entities to chase after you at a very micro level, at a very personal level. That's gold for them, but it's a nightmare for media, which used to go in this big kind of blanket. And so the resources fled. Newspapers, newsrooms shrank. We're now at a point where we will have lost about a third of the newspapers we had in 2005, just over the last 15, 18 years. We've lost tens of thousands of working journalists. Online media, online news operations have not begun to fill the gap. In fact, it's roughly a 10-to-1 ratio. You lose 10 journalists in traditional media, you get one replacement. And that's a somewhat of an unfair characterization, but it's relatively accurate. And what we know is that we are seeing a radical collapse even of a lot of online media efforts, right? They are great. Sometimes they do really good work, but they don't always survive. So we're in a point now where journalism is in massive crisis at the local and regional level. At the national level, it still works because it's sort of a one size fits all, and you've got some things going on there, but we've really lost it in a lot of this country. I had a big Nation magazine piece on this a couple of weeks ago, and I was surprised by how much response there was, because people basically were like, yeah, boy, that's our experience. And so what that's done to the media reform movement is take a movement that was saying at one time, wow, media just doesn't do a good job, right? And it needs to be better. It needs to be more responsive to people of all races, all creeds, all backgrounds, all experiences. It needs to be more integrated into its community. It needs to be able to speak truth to power rather than simply respond to power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all those things that we would say. It needs to be independent. Ownership needs to be more diverse, et cetera. Well, we said all that stuff, and then the system changed so much that now one of the things we're looking at is a system that isn't even there, right? That you're saying, well, newspapers should be better. Of course they should be, but they're closing left and right. Journalists should do a better job. Yes, of course, we all should do a better job, but we're being laid off left and right. And so a lot of what was the media reform movement of the early 2000s, when Free Press got going and some of those great conferences that you were at occurred, a lot of that has transferred now into a salvage effort, right? An effort to try and find a new way, a new model for journalism to survive in the 21st century. And it's intersected with a lot of the crises we have in our politics, because if we don't have a steady flow of solid information, which we can agree with or disagree with on, we can have our disagreements about, the issues, but there's some sort of core of information coming. Unless we have that, we're going to, silo off into incredibly angry and divided communities, which are unlikely to work with one another. And, you kind of end up in a slurry of misinformation, lies, propaganda, etc. And so we're now in this urgent point where we have to figure out how to recreate media, to create a media system that does journalism, that does give people the information they need, but is independent and free of government influence, free of corporate influence, etc. That's very hard. There's a lot of experiments going on right now, but I think that's where an awful lot of the energy of the movement is. And frankly, it's frustrating and it's hard. And I think the people who are working on it are heroes. Even if I disagree with them, I'm still involved to some extent with Free Press. I still write about these issues a lot. But I want to tell you that if you came to me for an easy solution to this, I'm going to tell you we're not in a place with easy solutions. We're in a place that's tough.